Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. We as a group have prepared this video that related to the Malaysia federal budget and tax revenue in the last 30 years and also the deficit budget good for the country. Malaysia is facing budget deficits every year since the government expenditure exceed the government revenue. If the government's budgets are not sufficient, some of the macroeconomic factors can be achieved. So, government cannot reduce unemployment and inflation rates and also cannot increase the economic growth and promote currency stability if they cannot reach a sufficient budget to cover all the expenditure. What is the federal budget? Federal budget is the government's estimate of revenue and spending for each fiscal year. Like a family budget, the federal budget itemizes the expenditure of public funds for the upcoming years. So, the federal government's fiscal year begins each October 1st. Some budget expenses are mandatory, such as money earmarked for the Medicare. Next is the structure of the federal budget. Number one is the government revenue. Government revenue refers to the revenue of the government financed by means of participating in the distribution of the social products, which is the financial resource for the answering the government to the function. And number two is the government expenditure. Government expenditure refer to the distribution and use of the fund the government finance has raised so as to meet the need of economic construction and various causes. Then, for the federal budget formula is the total revenue minus the total expenditure. Besides that, the federal budget is one of the most important policy instruments of our government. Through their budget decision, the leader of our country will fulfill their constitutional responsibilities, signal their policy priorities, and manage federal money. So the budget describes their decision to tax and spend, to borrow and lend, and to consume and invest. The decision also determines the size of the central government and its role in the national economy. After that, I want to tell about the type of budgets. First, the surplus budget. It can be a surplus budget if the expected government revenues exceed the estimated government expenditure in a particular financial year. Second is the deficit budget. It will be a deficit budget if the estimated government expenditure exceeds the expected government revenue in a particular financial year. Last type of budget is the balanced budget. It can be a balanced budget if the estimated government expenditure is equal to the expected government received in a particular financial year.
Okay, what is tax? Tax is defined as a fee charged levied by a government on a product, income, or activity. If tax is levied directly on personal or corporate income, then it is direct tax. Meanwhile, if tax is levied on a price of a good or services, it is called an indirect tax. Malaysia is a very tax-friendly country compared than the others. Income tax comparatively low, and many taxes which are raised in other countries do not exist in Malaysia. All earnings of companies and individuals accumulated in derived form or remitted to Malaysia are liable to tax. Government will use these tax revenues to fund all spending made by government in order to achieve an economic growth and also to promote the sound of the economy. Taxes collected from both direct tax and indirect tax. They are the government revenue. They are the government tax revenues. It includes collection from income tax, corporation tax, custom, wealth tax, tax on land revenue, and more. Direct tax is the tax that is paid directly to the government by the person or company on whom it is levied. Income tax, wealth tax, corporation tax, and property tax are some examples of direct tax. Meanwhile, the indirect tax, there are those that are collected by intermediaries from individuals and corporations who bear the burden of the tax and pass it to the government. Goods and Services Tax (GST) is one of the examples of indirect tax. Corporation tax forms a large chunk of the government tax revenue. Taxation is the primary source of income for the government. The most important revenue receipts for the government taxes are involuntary fees levied on individuals and corporations to finance government activities. Okay, revenue receipts can be divided to two types. First is non-tax revenue and the second one is tax revenue. Today I want to discuss about the tax revenue only. Tax revenue is the income gained by the government through taxation. Tax revenue forms a part of the receipt budget, which in turn is part of the annual financial statement of the union budget. Tax revenue is the result of the application of a tax rate to a tax base. Total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP indicates the share of the country's output collected by the government through taxes. Tax revenue can be regarded as one measure of the degree to which the government controls the economic resources. Next, there are three factors that determine the tax revenue, which are GDP, unemployment, and inflation. If, for example, if there is an increase in GDP or gross domestic product, there will be a decrease in the tax revenue. So it will be a very good thing for the economies to be developed or to become more stable. So now we know that tax is one of the ways to finance government expenditures and it has been an important component of government revenues. Okay, the share of tax in total revenues and the amount of tax collected differs among countries and they depend on the structure of the economy in each country. As in Malaysia, the share of tax revenue in government total revenue is relatively high. For example, the total government revenue in 1963 was 1,150 million ringgit, in which about 80% or 915 million was financed by tax revenue only. Meanwhile, in 2010, the total government revenue increased to 162,131 million, where the share of tax revenue was 107,092 million ringgit, which in percentage decreased to 66% of the total revenue. Okay, now we know this taxation become crucial economic tools to govern economics for any country, especially to developing countries like Malaysia, with a rapid trend toward globalization and internationalization, the pattern of tax revenues and economic growth across countries has become a significant concern to economists. Recently, Malaysia has also performed well and shows the similar growth pattern in economy. Therefore, funds collected from taxation used by the government to provide facilities for its population and for the development of the nation. The trend of tax collection in Malaysia is inconsistent, changing upward and downward depending upon economic conditions. However, over a 30 period, most years show an increasing incremental in total collection. The exceptions are when there is an abnormal economic condition such as financial crisis, war, or increase in world oil prices. For example, nowadays, with the COVID-19 crisis that affect the whole world, affect the health, people's health, not only in the Malaysia but in the whole world. So, in conclusion, tax revenue is surely play a big role in economic development if the abnormal economic condition did not occur in the first place. Thank you.
For federal and tax revenue, first of all, we need to know where does federal budget came from. For federal budget, it came from tax revenue, non-tax revenue, indirect tax, and lastly, borrowing and the government asset. Okay, now where will the federal budget will be spent on? It will be spent on in two big components, which is managing expenses and development expenditure. And under development expenditure and managing expenses, there are a few small components. For tax revenue, it came from three resources, which is direct tax, indirect tax, and non-tax revenue. Now, let's see the evaluation on the Malaysia federal budget and tax revenues in 30 years. First of all, based on the data given by the Ministry of Finance of Malaysia, uh, we need to know to gain federal budget, we need to subtract the total expenditure from the tax revenues. Now, based on the data, we can see that between year 2000 until 2004, the total tax revenue is stable and it increasing by year and year until 2004. So, in year 2000, the total tax is 61864 in million and it kept increasing until 2004 it reached 99,397 million. And also we can see that the government expenditure, which is in 2000 69313 also in million, and it reached until 120,162 on 2004. Next, based on year 1960 until 1999, we can see that the trend, when the total tax revenue high, then the government expenditure will also increase accordingly to the tax revenue. But when the total tax revenue fall, the government expenditure will also be lowered. In year 2001, the federal budget consumes 5.3% of the budget for COVID-19 pandemic. But it hits differently in 2020. There in the government budget, there is no uh, proportion for COVID-19 pandemic because it happened unexpectedly and it happened in July, which is after the federal budget is prepared. So, in short, we can conclude that the increase in the amount of tax revenues can also increase the amount of expenditure. When the amount of tax revenue increase, then the federal budget also can be increased accordingly to the tax revenues.
A budget deficit is when spending exceeds income. The term applies to governments, although individuals, companies, and other organizations can run deficit. A deficit must be paid If it isn't, then it creates debt. Each year, deficit adds to the debt. As the debt grows, it increases the deficit in two ways. First, the interest on the debt must be paid each year. This increase spending while not providing any benefit. Second, higher debt levels can make it more difficult to raise funds. Creditors become concerned about the borrower's ability to repay the debt. When this happens, the creditor demand higher interest rate to provide a greater return on this higher risk. That further increase each year's deficit. The opposite of a budget deficit is a surplus. It occurs when spending is lower than income. A budget surplus allow for savings. If the surplus is not spent, it is like money borrowed from the present to create a better future. If a deficit is financed by debt, then it has the opposite effect. It is money borrowed from the future to pay for the present standard of living. A balanced budget is when revenue equals spending. Most states must balance their budgets. The federal government does not have that restrict. A persistent deficit in the government budget would be a paramount issue to macroeconomic stability to any countries. Theory suggests that persistent and large budget deficits lead to a harmful effect on major macroeconomic fundamentals. In particular, massive budget deficit results in high interest rates as the government's demand for funds and this consequently conflicting with private sector demand for investment financing, thereby discouraging private investment expansion. The implication of high interest rate would affect severely residential construction, business investment in plant and equipment, and consumer spending on durable goods by such a fiscal policy and along with non-accommodative monetary policy. Moreover, the budget deficit may affect interest rate via the channel of reduction in savings or deposit in the banking system.